So you might think, oh, power purchase agreements. For those of you from livery companies online, it may seem a rather niche or interesting topic. For those of you who aren't from livery companies, and I think there's one or two of you, I guess you know all about it and you're interested to find out more. So we're going to start, I hope with some basics, but really we've got helping us today two absolute experts who will get into, in a sense, as much detail as is needed, and more so if you want it. But we want to make sure people understand what they're all about, what they do, and basically they're commercial vehicles whereby organisations can seek to buy renewable energy over a long time period. So power purchase agreements, PPAs. I hope there's not going to be too many acronyms, but PPA I'm sure will be one that will be used because the longer version is a bit too sort of cumbersome to say. So let's go to our two speakers then. Phil Dominy, who's a director at Ernst & Young, another initial, EY usually, a director of energy and infrastructure, and an absolute senior professional in this area. You won't hear anybody better speaking on this with passion and interest. And then equally as important, because Graham Lowe is our other speaker. Graham is the head of energy and sustainability, head of energy and sustainability at the City of London Corporation. So he's our, homegrown, if you like, captive city corporation person who has lived through the power purchase agreement that the City Corporation entered into. And in a sense, it's the fact that the City Corporation has entered into this, I think the first local authority to do so, this first corporation that's a local authority to do this, that sparked us into thinking, what are they about? How can we as individual entities, livery companies or other small businesses maybe do something similar? But I'll leave that sort of slight teaser till we get towards the end. And I'm going to hand over to Phil. There's going to be the two presentations with slides and a little video, and then we're going to come to questions. There's a Q&A button, so feel free to put Q&As in there. Please keep yourself on mute. Please keep yourself off camera, just to save sort of interruptions and distractions. But put your Q&As in the Q&A section, and we'll come to them and hopefully be able to answer all your queries at the end. So over to you, Phil. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, Alison. Right, let me see if I can just share my screen and we can go from there. So are people able to read my screen? See my screen? Sharing works?
Okay.
Not yet? Okay,
no.
Let's try that again. Share. How about now?
Perfect, yep. Thank you.
Perfect, yep. Okay, good. Second time lucky. Well, it's a delight for me to be here, and thank you very much for inviting me, Alison. It's a joy. As you say, I'm very passionate about renewable energy. It's what I do for a job, but it's also a sort of personal passion of mine. I'm a director in our strategy and transactions team here at EY, Energy and Infrastructure. And there are my contact details if you were to need them. But yeah, I've sort of really enjoyed the last few years working with the City of London. Obviously, you may have heard of the power purchase agreement that Alison's just mentioned, and you'll get to see a lot more about that later when Graham speaks. But my task for today is to try and make as simple as possible what is really quite a complex area. So I will be going into some detail, but I don't expect you to understand all of it. The slides will be shared after the event, so you haven't got to be scribbling away. You can sort of read them at your leisure, and maybe I won't cover everything that you'll see in front of you, but you'll have it there to take away. But in sort of time-honored fashion, I'll be looking at the what are corporate PPAs, the why behind them, the when, also where have they sort of actually kicked off in the world, and who's signing them. And then we'll probably go on to the most technical bit of it all, the different models or structures of corporate PPAs, the sort of how, I suppose. And finally, just to sort of draw it to a conclusion, what's the sort of balance between risks as well as the benefits? So first of all, the what. So a quick introduction to corporate PPAs. Alison already mentioned what the acronym is. It's a power purchase agreement. And basically, it's a long-term contract between a business, that could be private sector or public sector organization, to purchase electricity directly from a generator. And that I'll be talking mostly about off-site generation, but it could also be an on-site power purchase agreement. So direct relationship is the key characteristic, as I said. There's also a sort of verifiable connection, as you can see in the diagram below. There are sort of renewable certificates that transfer from the generator to the consumer, as well as the power. And then the corporate PPA revenues actually enable the project, so be it wind or solar, for example, to actually get built. So these are sort of long-term, steady cash flows, which are predictable, and hence developers can raise finance and build. So there's a real sort of cause and effect. A PPA is genuinely creating new capacity. You're not just sort of buying existing capacity or certificates. It's a real, you're making a difference. And in terms of benefits, just very briefly, it's ultimately to meet obviously carbon and renewable targets, carbon reduction targets, that is obviously. It also reduces exposure for the corporate consumer to volatile power markets. I mean, you've seen them over the last couple of years. They've been all over the shop, and I'll show some graphs in a bit. And to achieve significant savings against a sort of business as usual. At the moment, prices are very elevated, and although they're coming down, thankfully, they're likely to remain well above PPA prices for some time yet. And ultimately, it's all about good corporate citizenship. So just briefly between on-site and off-site, and then we will stay on the sort of off-site PPA piece, because that's what City of London have done, and that's what the majority of corporates do. But basically, on-site is, as it says, really, it's a power plant that's either on-site or potentially on neighbouring land, and literally provides power straight to the facility that's there. Typically, it's very limited though in scale. Obviously, you can't fit much on your roof or in the ground around you, so it's not really for much scale. And like an off-site PPA, the developer will cover the system installation and upkeep costs and maintenance of the system. So it's a very straightforward role for the corporate. You just pay for the energy that's produced. On-site corporate contracts are typically quite long-term, 15 to 25 years, because you could sort of imagine them as what's called they've got stranded asset risk because they're sort of tied to the site. Whereas off-site projects, the solar or wind is generating onto the grid, and so there's many more options for them. So PPAs are typically shorter, 5 to 15 years generally. In an on-site, the developer sells the power obviously just through the wire to the facility, and there is a ability to sell excess power onto the grid if there is excess power, and obviously to draw on any additional electricity when the sun's not shining or wind's not blowing. Off-site, all very similar, but obviously, as I say, the main thing is achieving real scale. And you don't need to co-locate obviously to do that. It could be anywhere in the country basically, and in City of London's situation, it's in a location far from the City of London, or not too far. I won't give the game away and say where it is now. That would be Graham's slot. But yeah, so developer sells electricity through the grid to the corporate at a generally lower price that's on the wholesale. So as I say, off-site PPAs are the sort of, well, they're the norm really for large corporates that really want to make a big dent in their carbon emissions from electricity. So this is a sort of typical sort of roadmap of a corporate moving from no renewables to 100% or nearly 100% renewables, and off-site PPAs provide the vast majority of that. And we've seen the benefits already. There are certificates that you can use to top up. You don't typically want to sort of put all your eggs in one basket and hedge for like a 10-year period on a PPA, because that's quite inflexible. So typically you won't have a PPA for full volume, but you'll have some flexible top up, and that could be from green tariffs or or certificates, but ultimately that's just an extra cost. It's not, so there's more financial issue. Additionality, it's not creating a new asset, so there's, it's not as beneficial in that respect, sustainability respect. And then you might have a little on-site that we've just talked about, a private wire, but as we've said, the scale is very small there. So off-site PPAs are really where it's at for most corporates. So in terms of the why and the when, we've talked about the what. So as I've mentioned, power markets, and I'm sure you've seen this in your own home electricity bills, are oscillating all over the place. So this green line was 2022, very, very high prices, particularly sort of August was the peak, when the sort of, obviously the war started, and then it got sort of worse in August when a pipeline was stopped, and then actually the market recovered. It sort of got into a new sort of norm, be it higher than where it's been over the last 5, 6, 7 years, but prices are still now around about the 120 mark, which is about twice what they were a long time. So I'm sure your home electricity bills are similarly probably about twice as much as they were. So that volatility is very hard to manage for corporates. So PPAs sort of in effect are trying to stabilize that, but also it's about long-term cost savings. So here in this graph is an illustration of a PPA price here in white, very sort of a flat price across a 10-year term. Here we've got 2024 to 2034. And then the yellow forecast curve is the wholesale price forecast. So here, very high prices at the moment, but they are forecast to come down, but there are significant savings early on, with the difference between the market price and the PPA price. So basically, the corporate's saving all of that difference, and then getting the stability in price as well. So so volatility and cost savings are two big drivers for corporates, as well as the sustainability benefits we already talked about. Just in terms of where they're happening, so globally, you can see it's a real sort of hockey stick of a growth. Started in the Americas, so that's the light blue here. Also extended now into Europe, so Europe, Middle East and Africa, but most of that is Europe, and then now a little bit in Asia Pacific in the red there. So a real significant increase in PPAs, corporate PPAs. And this is a schematic, and I have Bloomberg to thank for this. So it's a schematic between where corporate targets are likely to be for 2030. So if you can imagine they've got a target. If you look at all the sort of the RE100 companies, which have signed up to 100% renewable electricity by a certain date here, 2030, they need a lot of renewable electricity. And so this white is the sort of gap that's needed to be filled to reach their targets of basically 100% renewable electricity. Now, a lot of corporates, they've done a lot of energy efficiency, so there's been quite a bit of reduction in demand from some corporates recently, but actually a lot are now electrifying demand, so particularly around heat and our electric vehicles, they're forecasting electricity consumption to increase. So basically this gap here, this white gap here is what's expected to be filled by these offsite PPAs that are being signed. So that's the sort of driver, these corporate targets. So having had a bit of a background on the what and when, now we're looking at the where. So in terms of across Europe, you can see it's a number of different countries have got very different levels of PPAs, and we'll see a bit more about that in the moment. The UK is one of the leaders, together with Spain, Germany and the Nordics. But also here you can see the breakdown between wind and solar. So blue is the wind and yellow is solar. A lot of the early corporate PPAs, this is in Europe, this particular graph, were wind, and increasingly in more recent years, solar projects have come to the fore. But yeah, that you can see the growth then there. There was a little bit of a dip in 2022 when the power markets obviously took a big wobble in Europe, and so some of the corporate PPAs were delayed. So that just explains that little tick down, but there will certainly be a tick up in 23. And in terms of the the whereas, so that's the breakdown of the countries. You can see Spain, a very hot country for temperatures. You've seen the heat wave there recently, but in terms of PPAs as well, lots of very sunny climates are particularly good for solar. Sweden, the Nordics, very good for wind PPAs. Germany a mix, and similarly UK a mix of wind and solar PPAs. So we're up there in the top 5. And in terms of who's signing PPAs, there's a big sort of cross section of different sectors and industries, but particularly the large tech companies, the ICT companies and heavy industry, but also transport and consumer goods and telecoms as well. So now we get onto the slightly more tricky bit, the how, and don't worry if not all of this makes first sense to you straight away, but if you read slides later, you can hopefully understand more of it. This is just around pricing structures. Like many things, you can either have a flat fixed price in nominal terms, so literally even with inflation, it's not rising with inflation, it's just flat. It could be flat price, this is the yellow line, or you could have an index linked, CPI index linked, typically PPA price, so the yellow price. So if you did that, you'd have a PPA price that started a bit lower but would end up higher, or then you take the flat price. This grey line is just a sort of indicative sort of where the market could be against where your PPA price might be. So at the beginning of the PPA, at the moment, with high market price, you'll be making significant savings, then they'll reduce later on. Possibly then savings might increase if the market increases. That's by far the most common PPA pricing structure, index links or flat. You can have discount to market where it's just a certain percentage below the market price. But obviously then if the market moves and is volatile, your PPA will be volatile. So it's not that popular, even though it gives small amounts of savings against wholesale. Or you could have some sort of hybrid structure, which is halfway in between a sort of fixed price and discount to market or variable price. In terms of structures, and this is important because you'll hear a bit more about virtual PPAs later on, but a sleeve PPA structure, which is what City of London did, a physical structure. The corporate sits between the project, so wind or solar typically, and the corporate. So the corporate signs up a power purchase agreement with the project, pays money and receives the guarantee of origin or the REGO green certificates. The actual physical power will go into the grid and then gets what's called sleeved into the corporate's consumption wherever that may be in the country. So, and there's a sleeving agreement which does that, because obviously this power is quite intermittent or volatile in a way, because sun and wind are not constant, and so this agreement basically converts it to be in the shape that the corporate requires it for their consumption. But obviously PPAs don't provide all the consumption of corporate needs. They will still need to be a retail supply agreement which provides the rest of the power from the grid. There are various benefits and downsides. We haven't got time to go through all of those, but it used to be the most popular structure, the sleeve PPA, but now it's very much been taken over by what we call a virtual PPA or a financial PPA, and that's where it's a simpler structure. You can see that there are fewer lines on it than that one, but the corporate just has this virtual power purchase agreement with the project. It's in a contract for difference structure, which I'll explain in a minute, and has the guarantees of origin. And then it has the retail supply agreement still on this side. So that's providing the physical power and full energy security. All your power is always going to work. But the project sells the physical power into the grid here. Both structures, basically the PPA, as I mentioned before, enables the project to raise financing from investors. So provides with a nice fixed return to investors in return for their investment. So just to give you a little illustration of how a virtual PPA works. So it's basically a contract for difference, where if you imagine the yellow is the market price and the blue represents the PPA price. And so where the market price is higher than the PPA price, the developer will pay the consumer. But if the market goes below the PPA price, then the consumer pays the developer. So ultimately the developer gets a sort of fixed price, but also these offsets, so for example, when the prices are high in the market, the corporate will be paying high prices in the market, and so these offset those high prices. And then in this scenario B, prices are low in the market and the corporate's paying a low price in its retail supply agreement for power, and those savings will then pay the developer. So it's what's called a contract for difference, that the government use it also for auctions. But yeah, it's just as good as a physical PPA in enabling a new project to happen. Just added this slide in just to show, because this could be a scenario that City of London and other corporates explore in the future, where they try and get their supply chain to also sign up to corporate PPAs, and the supply chain might be small to medium enterprise businesses, and they can't on their own be big enough to do a PPA. But if they club together, then they could each have a sort of portion of a virtual power purchase agreement with a project, and that project can be enabled and come to life, and then they each can have their own separate retail supply agreement. So this is a club structure. I think Graham might talk about it a bit later, but I just thought I'd flag it at that point. I won't go through that. That just summarises really the difference between the physical and virtual. But basically, at the end of the day, they do both share critical characteristics. It's about additionality, providing new to earth or new to ground projects. It provides credibility from renewables and electricity flows. Both structures will give the corporate full confidence in electricity. And finally, before I hand on to Graham, so what are the risks as well as the benefits? So what we're seeing is the benefits. I've said many times about those during the presentation: cost savings, price security, brand reputational benefits, additionality, and ultimately reaching net zero targets. But obviously there are risks involved. It's not risk-free. You're punting on a market price in effect by signing up to a fixed PPA price. There's market price risk, where if market prices fall and you've fixed a price, obviously you'll be paying more than those around you. Volume risk, you're obviously dependent on how much sun shines and wind blows. Shape and profile risk, that's to do with the shape of how solar is generated, for example, during the day, and particularly in the summer, and not at the winter and overnight. So that provides a different shape to how many corporates will consume power, which is pretty flat over the 24-hour periods and over the seasons. Force majeure and change in law, things happen basically, don't they? And sometimes that can cause a project to have problems, and that's a risk. And counterparty risk, ultimately, there's a risk to a corporate if the developer goes bust or something. So that's a quick canter through PPAs, and I'm sure there might be questions later, so we'll hold on to those. But this is the last graphic for you, just to see the rise of corporate PPAs over the last 5 years, from about 14% to 35% of corporate volume is now through PPAs. Thank you very much, and I will hand over now to Graham, I believe. If I can stop sharing.
Thanks, Phil. Let me just get my slides up. Okay. Are they coming through?
Indeed. Thank
Excellent. Good afternoon, everyone. As Alison said, my name is Graham Lowe. I'm Head of Energy and Sustainability at the Corporation. And I really just want to kind of build on what Phil has just presented and tell you a little bit about our journey in terms of how we went about our PPA, starting with the projects. Again, some of those similar questions around why did we get involved with PPAs, how we went around it, and then really sort of building on what we've learned in that process, and finally really talking about that clubbing piece, how perhaps we can take this forward for the square mile, and how perhaps we can help as a corporation develop a multi-off-taker PPA, or a sort of a clubbed PPA for our organisations that reside within the square mile. So here's our big sort of piece in the story that was presented in the Guardian, sort of on our launch in back in November 2020, and this is when we signed our PPA deal with Voltalia. And back then it was a sort of a £40 million deal, and was the first sort of corporate PPA for local authorities at that point. There's been a few since then, but still not too many in the public sector. And our PPA is based down in Dorset, in close to a village called Spettersbury on South Farm, and it takes up around 130 acres of mainly arable land. I think it's grade 2, so not the best quality arable land, and consists of 93,000 panels. So quite a large area. It has a total output of 50 megawatts, or just under 50 megawatts, and that equates to around 65 gigawatt hours, sorry, 56 gigawatt hours per annum. So this is a sort of sweet spot for some PPAs, and that relates to around 50% of our power requirements, and that will fluctuate. It's slightly increased in recent years as we've reduced our energy consumption, but as Phil mentioned, we're looking at more electrification of heat, and also sort of electric vehicles coming online. We think that we'll end up around 50% of our power needs being presented through the PPA, which over the lifetime of the PPA, which is a 15-year PPA, relates to around 74 kilotons of CO2. So in terms of the CO2 being removed from that grid, it's quite significant. So why? Well, why has already been answered in some respects in regards to those kilotons of CO2 that will be removed, but some of the things we really need to consider are, what we term the energy trilemma, and how we look at certainty around our energy supply, how we can be provided with perhaps cheaper electricity, and then obviously the piece around green electricity. And so we've seen recently there's been a lot of volatility in the market in regards to energy prices, and absolutely having a PPA in place can help with that and give you some price certainty, and reduce the requirements or the expectations of budget shock. So sort of making sure that we can stick within those budgets, or at least try to. And then finally, in regards to clean, responding to the climate emergency, or helping reduce our carbon emissions and reaching net zero carbon targets. So I think they work very well together in terms of answering all of those three, and the PPA will do that. But really, they PPA could probably answer one of those and still have a fairly solid business case at this point in time. When we got involved with our PPA, this is how the markets were looking. So we were looking at PPAs back in 2018, and that was before I joined the corporation. But at that point, we had rising markets. But it is fair to say that markets are volatile and sometimes drop as well. And so when you're going into PPAs, we need to understand the risk around the markets, but also understand that inertia is also a risk. So doing nothing can sometimes be a risk in itself. And this is where we've ended up. So that last slide showed the markets back in 1819, and now we are faced with very different markets. That light green market indicator there at the top, showing how the UK electricity market has fared over the last year or so, and what those annual price points look like. So it went very, very high back in August, as fellas said. And the red line down here is kind of where we're at with our PPA. So you can see from a commodity point of view, the benefit quite starkly there at the moment, and that's translated in terms of savings over the last year and sort of the year to come of around £11 million for the corporation. So it has jumped up quite significantly from what was our original business case shown in this graph, which was £3 million MPV over that term. So the benefit really has come front and foremost over the last year with those increasing prices. Yeah, very much benefit sort of explosion there, if you like. So how? Well, Phil touched on some of this, but in terms of understanding how we were going to go about a PPA and what that looked like, first of all, we looked at the opportunities around the different structures. So would it be a physical or a virtual PPA? And for us, some of those questions around accounting practices meant that adopting a virtual PPA would be difficult. So we went along the routes of a physical PPA. But some of the questions we needed to think about were, did we want to buy into a solar farm or a wind farm which was already in existence, or did we want to look at something which was new build? And so, that goes along with the additionality and how we're able to use our leverage with the contractual negotiations and buying into a long-term agreement to build something which was new and would provide more renewable power onto the grid. So that's the route we took. And then we wanted to look at our technology and what was the best fit. And again, that was essentially largely a decision between wind or solar, and we ended up going to solar because at the time that was a better fit in terms of the size and scale of our needs, and also fitted well with our peak power needs in the summer. Then we needed to look at risk in regards to those opportunities. So the various different generators which were available to us and would be able to work with us. We needed to understand whether they had planning in place, whether there was a grid connection, and whether they had finance in place to try and de-risk the proposition. And I'm glad to say that Voltalia that we contracted with had planning in place, had a grid connection agreement in place, and had finance being a long way to being agreed. Timing, very important to understand how it fitted alongside our existing supply contracts for electricity, and how the long stop dates for those projects fitted alongside that. And then the size and the shape of that in terms of our own requirements, very important. So going on to some of the lessons learned, we've had an awful lot to contend with over this period, and during the construction we had a small matter of COVID to concern ourselves with, and that really did provide us with some challenges around lockdown, supply chain issues when the economies reopened, and then more recently we've had to deal with the advent of Brexit and also the impact of all of this on our dependent projects to get grid connections in place with the local district network operator. But looking back at the beginning, there is, an opportunity and a risk in regards to business as usual. We felt that getting senior buy-in very early and keeping your senior stakeholders engaged throughout was important and necessary to ensure success, and also that we had from early stages the right help involved. So Phil, I think, has already alluded to the fact that we work together with the commercial arrangements with our PPA, but it's also important to get specialist legal advice as well. So we learned that that was an important stage to tackle right at the beginning. In terms of the procurement, we obviously needed to ensure that we talked to the market and we had a good understanding of what that was able to deliver, and that we brought our sleeving supplier, which is our electricity supplier, providing the residual volume, brought them into the picture as early as possible to start to negotiate around the terms of the sleeving agreement that we needed to put in place to support the arrangements. And then also just to track the risks and to manage them. We found that we have had some delays because of largely unprecedented issues around supply chain, the pandemic, etc. And that's meant that we've had to be ready to adapt our hedging strategy for those delays and work with the generator closely and ensure that we're able to mitigate those as much as possible and help them with support around supply chain disruption, labour scarcity, etc. Try and unlock some of those issues for them. So in terms of the multi-off-taker, moving on to the next stages really for the corporation, we're looking to try and garner interest in taking forward a similar approach for other organisations in the square mile and trying to bring into play perhaps smaller organisations that can't support a PPA on their own and work together. So we are right at the beginning of this with EY, and again it's there to try and enable those smaller energy users to access PPAs, but also to bring on board perhaps collaboration with larger organisations that are able to support and advise in those areas that we talked about. We have EY on board to provide that commercial expertise and to develop the approach. And we are aiming for a similar sized aggregated demand of around 50 gigawatt hours, which again is that sweet spot. But there is opportunity for us to perhaps have several phases. So if there is a lot of interest, we can bring on board multiple options around multi-off-taker PPAs and deliver those in stages. And we have a workshop coming up, which I think if anyone on this call is interested in attending, I can put the link to the Eventbrite invitation so you can sign up, but that's looking to start on Thursday the 25th of May at 9:30, and that will be either in the Guildhall in person or online, and there's the link there, but I'll also put that into the chat so that people have that available to them. So that's pretty much it. This last slide is giving you some of the things that we'll be covering. So we'll be running through some of the fundamentals that we've talked about today, but also looking a little bit more in depth around the developer pool, perhaps providing more examples of the financials around net present value, perhaps some of those alternative models as well. So some of the themes for the workshop that will go into a lot more detail than we've been able to this evening.
Great. Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Phil and Graham. There's lots of very interesting, innovative work that's been done there, and it's really interesting to see it follow. Okay, I think we should say now cheerio, and we'll close down this. And so thank you all for attending. Bye for now.